My name is Susan Park Spencer. My date of birth is May 23rd, 1962. I was born at the Elizabeth Hospital, and it was right down the street from my mom and dad's house, and they're Barry and Betty Parks. And when my mom was getting ready to have me, she walked down about half a block to the hospital and had me, and she said she probably would have had to walk back home, but it was raining that day, so my dad came and picked her up in the car.
This interview is for the Prairie Grove Oral History Project, and we want to be sure that we have your permission to reuse it.
Yes, you have my permission.
Thank you, Susan. Tell me about your family and your siblings when you were growing up in Prairie Grove.
Well, my family on my dad's side has been in the West Washington County area since the 1840s. And when I was growing up, I spent a lot of time over at my grandparents' house. My grandfather was Jim Parks, and he had died several years before I was born, so I never knew him. My grandmother lived there, and going over to her house was like an adventure for me because she kept everything that her family had, photographs. She had her old side saddle that she got when she was 16 years old. There was a room upstairs that one of my cousins had she called it the ghost room, because there was a couple of portraits of, I believe, it was like maybe my great-great-grandmother and her daughter, and they were pretty spooky looking, and they hung on the wall, and you'd walk in and it was kind of scary when you were a little kid. But we played hide and seek in our house, and that's where my parents, or my dad grew up and his brothers. And my dad had 3 brothers. James Fay was the oldest, and then my dad and my uncle were identical twins, Barry and Donald, and then Joe was the youngest.
Tell me about your sister.
My sister's 3 years younger, and when we were growing up, we played outside a lot. One thing that we had to do, my family's business was the Prairie Grove Telephone Company, and still is, and so we were pretty active in that. During the summer, my dad would always find jobs for us to do. It was jobs like going down to the main office, washing windows, and we also got to clean the phone booths that was around the county. The upright standalone phone booths were made out of glass, so we got to clean the windows in there, and we also got to sweep out whatever was in there, usually cigarette butts. The worst was when people would leave their spit cups in there with tobacco juice, and it was really bad when somebody would knock it over.
What other work did you do at the phone company?
During the 70s, we started taking the aerial cable off the lines and burying them. So there was a whole bunch of splicing to do where the pedestals are. So one summer I spliced cable, and it was really messy because they had filled cable at that time. It was filled with this, it was like sticky Vaseline, and it covered the entire cable of the wires to keep the moisture out. And it was super messy, and by the end of the day, it was all over you. It was all over your clothes. I'd go home. My mom would say, "When are you going to stop doing this?" Because she would try to wash the stuff out of my clothes, and it wouldn't come out. My cable splicing career came to an end when I got poison ivy.
Tell me about your family routines, like at home. What were some of the things you would do and some of your chores around the house?
Well, my sister and I were both really involved in sports, so most of my time was spent either practicing basketball, playing softball. It was like year-round. I was always doing some kind of sports.
Okay. What are some of your earliest memories of Prairie Grove and its downtown area?
Well, my friends and I, we just walk everywhere. We'd go, we didn't drive at that time because we were too young, but we'd walk down to Harlan's, Five and Dime, and there was a woman that worked there, and she would, especially if you were a kid, she'd watch you like a hawk. You'd go down the candy aisle and she'd be there staring at you. And that was a little intimidating. I spent a lot of time down at the telephone office. Spent a lot of time in the telephone company truck with my dad while he'd go out on trouble calls. And so I would hand him tools. One of my earliest memories of doing that was down in Cane Hill. And we went to one of the houses there in front of the college. And I can remember the person who lived there. We were in the kitchen, and I don't know if they set me up on the counter, but I remember them pointing out, saying that building back behind there used to be a college. I traveled all over West Washington County with my dad, and at that time, we also had about, this is probably between 5 and 10 telephones in eastern Oklahoma, back right across the line. And that was really way out in the country, because no other, Southwestern Bell wouldn't serve that area, so we were like the last resort. I can remember going to, there was actually a house, I think it was outside of Lincoln, and I would usually get out with my dad and go with him into the house and help him. But this time he said, I want you to stay in the truck this time. And in the front, there was this old broken down car, and on top of the old broken down car, there was a goat. The house was kind of ramshackle. My dad goes in there, and he's in there for about 15, 20 minutes. He comes back out, and he was like, oh my. And apparently there was a hoarder that lived there, and they had stacks of magazines and newspapers where there was a trail. And so he finally found the phone and the jack. On top of the magazines and the newspapers were chickens. And he said there was not any room for you to even be in there, and it was kind of dirty too.
Tell me about going to school in Prairie Grove.
Well, when I graduated, we had the largest graduating class in Prairie Grove history at that time. It was about 76 kids. I actually went to Head Start in Prairie Grove because they didn't have a kindergarten program at that time. By the time my sister started school, they did have a kindergarten program, so that was started a couple of years after Head Start. And Head Start was started at that time just for rural schools who didn't offer kindergarten programs.
You talked earlier about some of the businesses in Prairie Grove that you remember. What are some of the other businesses you remember doing? And you go to the phone company a lot, and it's right downtown. What are some of the businesses you would visit? Or
Well, there was, of course, the dime store. The Southern was always fun to go into because the floors creaked. It was old. It had an upstairs. It had harnesses. It had saddles. It had refrigerators and freezers. It was just like anything you needed. You could find it.
Tell me about going to church here in Prairie Grove. Where did y'all go, and what did you do when you went to?
My family went to the First Presbyterian Church. They're on the corner of Neal and Bush Street. That church was actually started in 1907, I believe. It was started by my great-grandfather, Dr. E.G. McCormick, and there were several other families that started it. Before, they were meeting in the basement of the Methodist Church, and prior to that, there had been a Presbyterian church out, I think in maybe the Stonewall area, west of Prairie Grove, and that church had dissolved. And Judge Hanna was also a big member of that church.
What did kids do for fun when you were growing up in Prairie Grove?
Playing sports, softball, basketball.
What did the adults, your parents and some of their friends, what would they do for fun when you were growing up?
They would go out on Saturday nights and go out and eat.
Let's talk a little bit about the Battlefield Park. What was it like when you were a kid, and then how did it change over the years?
The Battlefield Park was a lot more quaint back then. They had a couple of wooden outhouses for restrooms. I remember going in there one time, and there was a bunch of spiders, and I never went in there again. We used to square dance. I started square dancing when I was about 4. We square danced in front of the Latta Barn on a raised platform, and my partner, I think it was the first year I square danced, but my partner fell off the stage.
Tell me about the tradition of square dancing. Do you know who started that?
Peggy Parks did, my aunt. And she was a 4th grade teacher, and she wanted to learn or teach her class the Virginia Reel. And this was, Wayne Carnahan was one of the students, I believe. And he, so anyway, they did an exhibition over at the Clothesline Fair, and it was so popular that they decided to continue it.
So, if someone asks you to tell me about your hometown of Prairie Grove, what's it like? What would you tell them?
It was a really nice place to grow up. The people are really friendly. It's not as close a community as it used to be when I was growing up because there's a lot more people, but they still they've always done fun projects together. If it's, like at the Battlefield Park, whenever somebody has a death in the family or something, there's always support. And, people bring food, try to help out as much as they can.
Also, let's talk about your dad and his brother. They had quite a reputation for helping people in the community and just being real civic minded. And can you tell me some stories about them that maybe people don't know? Well,
my dad and my uncle wanted to keep the downtown and the town looking good. They would go around and pick up trash. They would mow. My uncle Donald was notorious for riding around on his mower mowing. He'd mow leaves on the street. He would, if somebody needed their yard mowed, it'd get mowed. They were very picky about keeping the telephone company looking really nice. And, oh man, I can't think of any specific stories.
What about the tree story?
Oh, about him getting sued? Well, it was over by the Presbyterian church, and there was a tree that some of the branches had grown over, I guess, onto the church property, or I'm not real certain about that, but anyway, he trimmed this tree, and it could have been over at his house. And the tree owner was a lady, and she didn't appreciate that, so I think she ended up suing him, and won, I believe.
Well, I know that some of the employees have said from the phone company that the Parch Brothers would send them out to pick up trash and to mow around town to try to keep the town always looking really nice.
Yes, and I think if you set your brush out and the city doesn't pick it up, I think eventually there's a telephone truck that'll swing by and pick it up.
And I've also heard stories that both of the brothers were good about doing things to help the city, but not ever really wanting anybody to know that they were behind it. Do you know any stories? Do you have any examples of that, or is that's right?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds exactly like something that they would do, because they didn't do it to take credit for it. They just did it because they knew that they wanted the town to look good. They didn't want a dumpy town.
Tell me more about the phone company from its very founding until today. What you can remember?
Well, the telephone company got its start in 1888. My great-grandfather was Dr. E.G. McCormick. He had an office that I believe was in the downstairs part of what the Ace Hardware building is now. He co-owned the McCormick Brothers pharmacy or drugstore with his brother Will McCormick, and it was across the street. So they strung a telephone wire between his office and the drugstore. In 1906, they incorporated the telephone company. It was Dr. McCormick, Will McCormick, and at that time, Mel Collier worked at McCormick Brothers too. And Mill Collier actually started the first drugstore in Prairie Grove years before. Mr. Collier eventually left Prairie Grove and went to Fayetteville and opened up his own drugstore, and they're still going today.
Tell me about how your dad and his brother eventually became very involved in the phone company and ran it for many years.
My great-grandfather had 3 children, Grover and Myrtle and Arthur. Myrtle was my grandmother, and she married Jim Parks. Jim Parks started working for the telephone company as a switchboard operator, and he eventually worked his way up to being president. During the war, World War II, of course, all the boys, their sons, who were James, Faye, Barry, Donald, and Joe. James Faye had moved to Chicago and gotten married and had a little girl. The 3 other sons joined the military, and so it was basically my granddad and a couple other people that ran the phone company at that time. After the war was when they really started working on building up the telephone company. And my dad said, he told me one time that some of the best years of his life were when he was digging post holes for the poles and stringing the wire and doing all the physical labor. But that's, a lot of people helped out with that, including Calvin Bain. He worked a little bit. Jack Harlan worked for him. There was quite a few of the younger people that helped out building up the phone company.
What else can you tell me about the phone company that you can remember?
When it was upstairs, it ended up upstairs from Dr. McCormick's office, and you could see all the wires going into one of the windows, and that's where the switchboard was. One time there was a switchboard operator was sitting there, and all the wires were coming in, and she saw one of the wires moving, and it turned out it was a black snake. And I think she probably left her post at that point.
What about the switch from, or back in the days when you had party lines?
Yeah, the telephone company was one of the first in the state to get rid of all their party lines. But I can remember when I was growing up calling my friends, and there'd be other people on the line that you could hear, and sometimes they'd get mad because they wanted to talk or call somebody, and there was one time I was talking to a friend of mine, and this woman came on and said that she needed to call the friend to talk about her bean soup recipe or something. So,
were there any other stories maybe that I forgot to ask about that you want to tell?
Well, I remember my dad telling me a story about Miss Butler and Miss Catlett, and Miss Butler went over to see Miss Catlett, and she opened the back door, and her cat got out, and one of them said, "Oh, Miss Catlett, your butt got out." And this was back in the 20s, and my dad said they were both horrified because it was not ladylike to say something like that. And the one that was visiting turned around and took off for home. They were both mortified.
Any other funny stories or interesting tales you can tell about Prairie Grove?
No, David would remember a lot of those.
I know that you've been real involved in researching the history of Prairie Grove, and I wanted you to share maybe, and use, if you need to, use your notes to tell me about the history of Prairie Grove.
Okay, I do have some highlights of Prairie Grove history here, and I will have to refer to my notes. But I'll start at the way beginning. So prior to the arrival of white settlers in the early 1800s, this region was home to the Osage and Indian tribes. Several of the very first white men to stay in the area for a time were Thomas Wagnon and brothers James and Isaac Mars. They stayed in the West Washington County area during 1817 and 1818 in order to map the land, to hunt, and to look for potential farmland. Apparently James Mars brought his wife and 5-year-old daughter Rachel with him because Rachel Mars died in 1818 and is the oldest documented burial in the Prairie Grove Cemetery. She's buried east of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church and in the historic section of the cemetery, and that was placed on the National Register in January of 2016. So Wagnon and the Mars brothers went back home to Tennessee, but Isaac Mars and Thomas Wagnon returned in 1827 with their families and slaves, and they settled in the Ray community north of Lincoln. Thomas Wagnon also claimed additional land around the spring in what is now Mock Park. In 1829, Andrew Buchanan, who had recently become an ordained minister with the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, left Kentucky with his wife Sinai and stepson James Preston Neal to visit his brothers in Cane Hill. During his visit, he heard about this nice piece of land with a spring several miles to the northeast, which was Thomas Wagnon's claimed land. He made an agreement with Wagnon to trade the land for 2 good sermons, and so he got that land and built a house on it. In 1831, Buchanan organized the Prairie congregation of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, and later on a school for young children was started. The congregation bought for $25 about 2.5 acres from the Buchanans in 1838 with a promise to build a church, a school, and use part of the land as a cemetery. At some point, a log building was constructed that served as the church and the school. The first post office in Prairie Grove was opened in 1840 and was called Sweet Home, and it closed 6 years later. Archibald Borden opened the second post office in 1857, which was named after his daughter Ada. The building was hit by bullets during the Battle of Prairie Grove and never reopened. Years later, the door, which had bullet holes in it, was stored in a garage after the post office was torn down, and the door was destroyed in a fire back in the 50s, I believe. The Battle of Prairie Grove started on December 7, 1862, and the Confederates used the Cumberland Church as a hospital during the battle. After the Confederates retreated south to Van Buren, the building was used to house the Union Army soldiers for several months. And when they left, it's believed that they set fire to the building and destroyed it. Around 1874, the town's second school opened in the newly constructed Cumberland Presbyterian Church. And this was a wood frame building that was located behind the current Presbyterian Church, and it faced east. In 1883, the Prairie Grove Institute, or the Methodist Academy, opened on the northeast corner of Bush and Neal Streets. It was the town's first school to teach children and teenagers. In 1901, it joined the new public school district. Also in 1883, the Ozark Mercantile, later renamed the Southern Mercantile, was built, and it's currently the oldest building on Main Street. The first brick building was constructed 3 years later across the street on the east side of the Southern, and it's still there also. In 1937, the owners tore down the second floor. In 1888, the third and current Cumberland Presbyterian Church opened, and the old church and school directly behind it was sold and dismantled. I'll mention James P. Neal. He was Andrew Buchanan's stepson, and he was an important part in Prairie Grove history. He eventually left Prairie Grove and became a lawyer in Fayetteville. He was a soldier in the Mexican-American War from 1847 to 1848, and he came back to Fayetteville and was elected mayor from 1851 to 1854. Neal returned to Prairie Grove in 1868 and settled on part of the old Buchanan property near the spring where he grew up. In 1871, he decided to formally establish Prairie Grove as an actual town and was soon appointed postmaster. A blacksmith and wagon shop opened in 1872. 3 years later, a storehouse was built, and in 1876, a steam-powered flour mill began operation. Main Street lots went on sale in March of 1877, and in September of that year, Neal requested a survey and plat for the downtown area. In 1888, physicians E.G. McCormick and W.W. Mahan got fed up with the rowdy behavior and what they described as drunkenness on the city streets, and they wrote a letter of incorporation and petition on a piece of notebook paper and sent it to the county judge, and the state approved its incorporation in July of 1888. In 1901, the first bank, called the Bank of Prairie Grove, opened. Also in 1901, a section of the Frisco Railroad line, the Ozark and Cherokee Central Railroad, began running, and the train depot was located several blocks south of Main Street. Around 1904, the Prairie Grove Canning and Evaporating Factory opened, processing locally grown fruits and vegetables, especially tomatoes. It's later renamed the Prairie Grove Canning Factory, and hundreds of local people, including families and their children, were employed at the business until it closed in 1978. In 1905, the Prairie Grove Public School graduated its first class with a grand total of 5 students. A year later, the downtown businesses on the north side of Buchanan Street were destroyed by fire. They didn't have access to water, so dynamite was used to slow the flames, and that shattered windows of the businesses across the street. In 1908, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, also known as the UDC, purchased 9 acres of land where the Battle of Prairie Grove was fought so they could create a park for Confederate veteran reunions. In 1911, a new 3-story public school building opened on the site of the old Prairie Grove Institute. And in 1931, another school building was added for elementary students across the street on the south side of the existing school. The Prairie Grove Public Library opened in the American Legion hut in 1935. The librarian's salary was paid for by the New Deal's Work Progress Administration Program, or WPA. In 1942, the railroad line and depot closed, and in 1951, the first school buildings on the current campus were completed. The first clothesline fair was held at the Prairie Grove Battlefield Park in 1957, and vendors hung their artwork on clotheslines. The Art Center of the Ozarks and the Prairie Grove Lions Club sponsor this annual event. In 1963, Dr. Will Mock donated to the city the land where the spring is, which he had bought in 1901, and it officially became Mock Park. And there's more recent stuff, but it doesn't interest me as much.
Let's fast forward a little bit and come back to, let's say, when you graduated high school. And I know there was a big history about done in '88, I think.
Yeah, the centennial history of Prairie Grove.
What are some major things that have happened since then? I know one of them we could talk about is the Battlefield Park expansion. Mm-hmm. And do you know a lot about that?
Well, I know that there was a commission, and it was a big commission, and I've got some information on that. I think I've actually got a picture. My grandmother was on it, and Donna was on it. And there were some well-known historians in Fayetteville that were also on it. I'd have to get more information on that.
What are some things that come to mind with you about Prairie Grove that have happened in more recent history, maybe since that last history book was done, that noteworthy things?
The town's gotten a lot bigger. And we used to be bigger than Farmington. Farmington's bigger than we are, and that's due to the growth of the whole area.